Hi everyone, my name is Aylin Elmali, and this is the presentation for my thesis on ethical software design, creating a non-predatory application model. So we use gaming and social media programs pretty much every day. I'm sure all of you have used at least one of these every single day. Um, they've become a pretty integral part of our day-to-day lives, whether you're checking social media or playing some sort of online game. Um, they're a pretty integral part of our lives. And what I want to know is what effects does that have on our well being? The link between social media and mental health has become a pretty hotly discussed topic over the past couple of years. Social media addiction has been linked to lowered self esteem, lowered academic performance, and just overall having consequences on mental health. And gaming addiction has similar issues, but it has the added financial cost because there are so many in game purchases. If you're really into gaming, I'm sure you've heard about the controversy surrounding loot boxes over the past couple of years. Because the problem is that they function very similar to gambling, and especially because young people and kids use games a lot, it's like, hey, isn't this like technically getting kids addicted to gambling? And the problem is that gambling is very heavily regulated, but these games are not heavily regulated in the US. So there's very little oversight as to um, preventing kids from getting addicted to um, these sort of in-game purchases, which obviously that can have financial consequences as well as consequences for mental health. And the main issue is that these sort of programs and apps are designed to prolong use for as long as possible. They want as much as your attention for as long as possible, um, and to keep you using it and not move on to doing something else. So the main research questions that I developed for this project were um, the first question is, what is sort of the business or financial incentives for these companies to get the users addicted to their products, whether it be trying to get money or data from the user, or whatever it is that they're trying to get. The second question was, how do they get users addicted to these products? Like, how are they designed? What are the features that are implemented to have this effect on users? And how are users who are particularly vulnerable or susceptible to addiction affected by this, whether that be children or just generally just people who have a susceptibility to addiction? The third research question was, what are any current laws or regulations that exist for these companies to protect users, and particularly vulnerable users, whether that be children or other sort of vulnerable demographics. And I looked at laws in the United States as well as in other countries, to say, like, hey, how are other countries dealing with this issue as well? The fourth research question was, what are potential solutions that can be proposed to sort of address this problem, whether that be any more regulations that should be implemented by the government or just sort of self-regulation from within the industry. So the first part of my project was to do a survey because I wanted to see, like, hey, what do students at UMass have to say about this? Like, what have been their experiences with these issues, especially because young people and college students are some of the people who use social media and gaming apps the most. Um, so we had about 66 participants in total. Basically, I went to UMass groups online and just posted, like, hey, here's the link to this survey. And so we got about 66 participants. The questions were about students' use of social media and online games. Just asking, like, hey, what have been your experiences using these? Have you suffered any sort of negative consequences? And many of the questions were based on assessment of common symptoms of addiction, including hiding the amount of use, not being able to stop using or cut back on use, or using to escape negative emotions or sort of avoid responsibility, which I'm sure all of us have done at some point. Um, And so we had about a pretty substantial number of students reporting having at least a few sort of negative effects or consequences on their well-being, whether that be sort of their mental health or financial or other sort of consequences. And of the questions that were designed or written around symptoms of addiction, about 38% in total answered yes to 5 or more of these questions, which is a pretty significant number. Obviously, this isn't any sort of like official diagnosis of addiction because I'm not qualified to make any sort of diagnosis, but that's just sort of like an indication of, hey, this person is showing some pretty strong indications that, they're having a problem with their use of social media and gaming apps. So, and the fourth question, this was an open-ended question. A lot of them were just sort of either multiple choice or yes or no, but I had one question that was like an open-ended response, and that gave the user the ability to sort of write a paragraph about just in general whether they felt that they were concerned about their use. And it was almost split, I would say half and half, whether they felt concerned or not concerned. There were a couple of responses that were also kind of mixed. So I split these into different categories using a qualitative analysis app. And I kind of divided into different subcategories. So of the students that said that they weren't concerned, a lot of them obviously brought up the COVID pandemic because they was like, hey, we're in a pandemic and yeah, I'm using social media a lot because there's not really much else to do because we're just stuck at home. Obviously, the pandemic had, an effect on this because people's use of social media and just online games in general, that's increased because, you're at home, you don't have much else to do. Some of them also mentioned like, hey, I enjoy using these and I don't feel like it's having any sort of effect on me negatively, or I use them to socialize with others. Again, because of the COVID pandemic, that's the only way people can communicate. And some of them said that they felt that they were pretty well balanced in their schoolwork, or some of them just said that they didn't really use many of these sort of apps at all. But then of the students that said that they were concerned, a lot of them mentioned that they felt that it was a distraction from their schoolwork or from other sort of important activities, and that they felt that they weren't able to stop using it or cut back on their use. Many of them said that they felt like they'd had a sort of lack of motivation to stop using them and to do something else. And many also said that they felt that it was having an effect on their mental health, and that they noticed a decline in their mental health. So those were some pretty eye-opening responses, and what I wanted to do was create a business model that could help sort of address this problem. So I split it into 9 different components, and I'm going to go through each of these. The first one was, what is the service being provided by this platform? So when a company designs any sort of software product, like what is the benefit of this supposed to be for the user? The ACM and other organizations have these sort of ethical guidelines for computing, which say that software should always be created for the greater good and to benefit society as a whole. And these do have positive effects for the user. Social media can help users stay connected with their peers and also stay connected with like current events as to what's going on in the world. It can also help users or brands sort of reach a larger audience and be able to distribute their content. And gaming, even though it's mostly seen as just like a recreational activity for fun, that's a benefit as well, and it can also provide brain stimulation, stress relief, and development of problem-solving skills. So the design of these platforms should always try to maximize these benefits for the user as much as possible and minimize any sort of negative effects, and that's true for any sort of software that's being developed. The second component was customer demographics. So who is this platform being designed for and who is mainly using it? The platform should always be designed appropriately for the target demographic. especially if this group requires special protections. Like if you're making a app for kids, that's going to need to be designed very differently from something that's for adults. Certain conditions can also may have to be taken into consideration, like um, for example, if you have, you know, if you're making an app that people with epilepsy might use, obviously you don't want to have any sort of like flashing images or, those sorts of things also need to be taken into consideration when you're designing any sort of software. You should also always be mindful of who's using this software, and if there's a discrepancy between who was the intended user base and who's actually using it, that you might need to adjust this. Like, for example, if you're making an app that is, or any sort of software platform that is supposed to be, for kids only, but then, or excuse me, for adults only, but then you find out that there's kids who are using it, you might have to take some special precautions to stop them from being able to access that platform. Um, the next one was outreach. So, how is this platform going to be distributed and marketed to potential customers? And obviously, to be sort of maintain ethics, you should always market this honestly and avoid bait and switch like tactics, which unfortunately a lot of current software is designed using this sort of freemium model where it's marketed as like, hey, this is either free to use or very, very cheap. But then, of course, there is the sort of hidden cost of whether they be like in-game purchases that you're not really told about until you actually start using the game, or with social media, a lot of times it's data collection, like your data being sold. Those can be kind of predatory in nature because until you don't really see the true cost of it until you're really invested in that platform. So, games should include advisory warnings, especially for parents if this is a game for kids. Like, if this game has in-game purchases, that should always be made very clear to the user before they start using it. And for social media platforms, they should always make that information regarding data collection clear. Like, you should be able to know who is your data being sold to, how is it being collected, what data exactly is going to be collected on you, things of that nature. The next one was customer relations. So how is the company going to maintain customer satisfaction and respond to the concerns of users? Obviously, any software company needs to provide customer support if customers are having technical issues. But another thing I want to focus on was software companies being able to respond to collective concerns about the platform, not just technically, but also like if a lot of customers feel that this platform's having a negative effect on them mentally or otherwise, that should also be dealt with by the software company. I read this great article in the New York Times that said that currently the Silicon Valley doesn't have a great reputation for dealing with these sort of ethical issues. They said that the motto of the medical field is do no harm, but the motto of Silicon Valley is build it first and ask for forgiveness later, which I thought that was just kind of like a great way to sum it up. It's basically just like, hey, we're gonna build this software platform with very little consideration as to any sort of effects that this might have, and if it has negative effects, we'll deal with that later, or we'll just like say, oops, sorry. But currently, these platforms are being designed and ethical considerations like this are not really being taken into account. So one way to really deal with this is for companies to actually take note, like, because there are a lot of these studies that are coming out showing that, hey, yes, there is this link between social media having a negative effect on mental health. Social media companies need to be aware of that. And there's companies should also do their own studies to see like how is our platform affecting users, and just to sort of be more aware of that and have a department within the company that addresses issues like this, so it's not just cast aside and never dealt with. So revenue and profits is how is a profit going to be made from this product. So most social media platforms are free to sign up for, so it's like, okay, so if they're free to use, then how do they make money? off of the platform. And a lot the way that they do this most of the time is by selling advertising space. Which that's not a new concept. A lot of media platforms, whether they be television or radio, have sold have advertisements on them and sort of sold that in the past. But what makes social media a bit different and a little more ethically dubious is the ads are targeted towards the users based on data that's collected from the user as they use the platform. Um, and that's become a huge issue recently for, privacy concerns. Um, and games, video games, the old way and the sort of the traditional way was just to, we develop a game and then people buy the game and then the game sales, that sort of makes up our revenue. But a lot of games now have started kind of moving away from that, and they've moved towards that sort of freemium model of, hey, you can download this game for free, or some games you still have to buy, of course. That traditional game sales, that's not gone away completely, but they've started moving more towards getting the revenue from in-game purchases and, again, loot boxes, which those have become, of course, more controversial because there was more of an element of chance. Like when you buy a loot box, the idea is like you don't know exactly what you're gonna get in it. So if there's like some rare item that you want, you might have to keep buying it over and over and over again until you finally get it, and you don't know like how much money that's gonna cost in general. And so there are a lot of these like sort of ethically dubious methods that these companies use to generate revenue. And the problem is, of course, that a lot of users have come to expect these services to be free, which means that they have no choice but to sort of use this model of selling advertising, because people, like, you don't expect to pay for Facebook or Twitter or any of these sites. You just want to be able to use it for free, and there's been sort of this trade-off of, like, what are users being willing to pay for versus how ethical are the methods of generating revenue going to be. So there might need to be this sort of change in, like, if you want more ethical methods, you have to change what you're willing to pay for these products. The next kind of ties into that is cost. So not only how much money is the company gonna how much revenue is going to be generated, but what is the cost of development and maintenance for this product. And that can be just overall developing the product, maintaining the product, the salaries of the employees, and also paying to be able to host the platform. Games, especially a lot of like major online games, they are increasingly very expensive to make. They can, like, some of the biggest, most popular games can be like millions of dollars to make, and if profit isn't made, that obviously can have consequences for the employees. Like if a company sees that they're not going to generate as much revenue, they might start laying off employees. So it also can have consequences for the people that work at these companies. So obviously the issue is, how do we generate revenue and make our company successful, but also not use these sort of ethically dubious methods of generating revenue. So as for existing regulations, the United States has some regulations, including Section 230 of, and if you've been following the news recently, you've probably seen that law has actually come under fire recently, and there are a lot of attempts to sort of either change it or just get rid of it entirely. But basically, it's a law that grants online platforms immunity from liability for what others post on that platform. And that's kind of been called like the Magna Carta of the internet, because it's granted social media platforms sort of the freedom to not have to like monitor or regulate every single thing that's posted, or not be seen as accountable for what is posted. But there are still some other regulations. COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. That protects children under the age of 13, basically saying that you cannot collect data from children under 13 without the consent of their parents. And that's why a lot of online platforms, you have to be 13 or older to use them, because there's very strict regulations as to what data you can collect from children under 13. In fact, recently, I think YouTube got in trouble for this because they were like, hey, they were like, because in YouTube you don't have to log in, or I think you have to be 13 or older to make an account, to make a Google account, but you can use the app at any age. So they came in fire because like, hey, you're collecting data from kids who are watching these videos. So there's very, very strict regulations for children under 13. But the EU actually has even stricter privacy laws under the GDPR. They basically say that any company must gain consent from the user every time data is requested. And they have very strict regulations as to how companies can handle this data. They also have a right to be forgotten clause, which requires that companies have to delete all personal data if that's requested by the user. And so my idea was that the US should, so also there were laws about loot box regulation, where China and Japan have kind of passed these kind of similar laws saying that companies should have to release the algorithm for how loot boxes work, and have sort of like caps on how much users can spend in a limited amount of time on things of that nature. So I said that the US should kind of follow that regulation, and have more transparency as to how these algorithms function. Another idea would be to say that anything that you can get through a loot box, you should also just be able to purchase directly. So I think that would be a more ethical way to generate revenue while not having this like gambling like feature, saying if you want an item, you can just buy it directly. And the US should also have stricter regulations for privacy and data, kind of following the GDPR. I believe recently in California, they actually passed a law that was a bit similar to the GDPR. So my idea was that there should be something like that federally, not just in California. So business partners, that refers to who will be the business partners for the company. And a business partnership is any sort of relationship between two commercial partners. So for social media platforms, obviously they form partnerships with advertisers. But that can also be for hosting advertisers like YouTube and Google AdSense. And also for data analytics, Twitter and Google Cloud have a partnership where Twitter uses Google Cloud to be able to do machine learning and analyze data. So I say that companies should always be very selective in who they partner with, because if you're giving a third-party user data, you need to be careful that you're giving it to a reputable source and that can be trusted with that user data. And finally, there is design and features. So how is the platform going to be designed? And if there are any harmful features, what should be excluded and what should be included? And again, as I said, a lot of features currently are sort of psychologically manipulative into keeping the user using it for as long as possible to collect as much data as possible or get the user to spend more money on it. And there are a lot of sort of psychological known effects that are kind of manipulated. One's called the endowment effect. Basically, this means that the more time that you invest in an application, the more difficult it is to stop using it. Or there's another effect where games in particular manipulate this a lot, where if you are doing a task and that task is interrupted, that can sort of result in stress for you. So a lot of the ways that games take advantage of this is that, like, say you're playing a level in a game, a lot of the times it will be made to be like really, really difficult, or potentially some people think that they might even make it like impossible the first time around, and then if you like run out of lives or something, it's like, hey, your progress in this game has been interrupted, but if you just spend money to buy more lives, then you can keep playing the game, and that's one way that users are manipulated into spending money. Other features like endless scrolling in social media apps keep you using it, like especially for TikTok or Facebook or YouTube or other sort of platforms. You can just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and never stop. Or sometimes you can even refresh your social media feed. So if you've been scrolling for a while and then you just refresh it, it's almost like another sort of gaming-like feature where you're presented with a new stream of content. And then occasionally you'll find something interesting and you'll look at that, and it's this flow of content that never comes to any sort of natural stop. So what I said was that my idea for a way that these platforms can be designed is some of these features should be either minimized or just cut out entirely for users under the age of 18. And one example is, of course, endless scrolling. If the site knows that you're under 18, the idea is that there should be a cap on how far you can scroll until you kind of come to an end of your feed. And so the idea is that, like, you're using the same platform, but you're just using a version of it that has some of these harmful features kind of cut out or minimized. And then I said for others, if you're over 18, you can kind of opt out or choose whether or not you want to have these features in your settings. Many platforms, or the Apple iPhone, I know, has also had like screen time functions that let you keep track of your use, and that's a good start for you to be able to track like how much time are you spending using these apps. But one addition that I'm suggesting is that if you've been using the same app for a long time, the app could maybe have a notification saying, hey, do you want to maybe take a break and move on to something else because you've been using this app for a long time. And that can be a way to sort of like trigger the user to be like, hey, maybe I should like stop and move on to something else. I said that games should also be designed to let users make progress at their own pace and not penalize them for not frequently using the app like every day. There are some gaming apps that are like designed to like, you have to use this every day, and if you don't, there's like consequences. And I said that should be changed, and that games should sort of respect the time of the user and just let you make progress at whatever pace you feel is best for you. So in conclusion, there are documented ramifications on mental health from these platforms, including the survey that I did. And in general, ethics in computing is a pretty under-discussed area. Currently in this sort of environment of computing, there's a real lack of accountability for any sort of ramifications that a lot of these platforms might have on users. And that's something that obviously needs to change, and there obviously needs to be more of a discussion about taking responsibility for the effects that software has on its users. So I said that basically there are more regulations that are going to be needed that will need to be imposed on the industry, but also that the industry should self-regulate and sort of monitor itself as well. And in general, software should always be designed with user well-being as a priority and not just as an afterthought. So this applies to not just individual developers, but software companies as a whole. Anytime you're designing any sort of software platform, you should always consider the well-being of users and take preventative measures to protect users from being negatively affected by your platform. But if your platform is already out there and is having negative effects, always take responsibility for that and take steps to address the problem. So thank you. That's been my presentation. If you have any questions, you can email me here. My email is up on the screen. Thank you very much.